the previous videos, we mentioned about the literature review. There are quite a number of questions that you can ask yourself during the literature review, which you should address your literature review in two levels: what the literature says and how it is related to your research. You know that while doing the literature review, not only you need to comprehend the content of the literature review, there will be elements of analysis, which during this analysis, critical thinking skill will need to be incorporated. There will be your own opinions on certain things, especially based on the information that you have gathered through lateral comparisons or reorganizing of the respective informations. The comprehensions will be elevated to another level, translating those informations to something which is meaningful to your research. While you are doing the literature review, your mind should not be too passively guided by the directions and thoughts given by the authors, as this will lead you to a stage that you find yourself lost without the clear directions. The best way for you to do this literature review, it is for you to have some prior purpose and then seeking for the respective answers. Then your directions and the purpose are clear, and those literatures and articles are actually helping you to achieve your purposes. During the reading process, you need to be critical. Being critical not necessarily meaning criticizing. You don't have to criticize the works provided by the other researcher. You should be thankful to them spending so much effort and willingness to share informations as well as the findings out of their research. Therefore, the first thing about your attitude, you should be humble and always be respectful to the others who are willing to share their knowledge. In fact, there is no restriction for you to criticize something. You can actually do that, but you will have to do it in a polite way, in a very professional way. Personally, I will position myself pointing out the strength and weakness or analyzing the works done by the other people instead of criticizing somebody, as this is going to make it personal. You can choose to identify the strength and the weakness, and I would recommend you not to stop at this level. This is just at the level of analysis. You will have to elevate this to something which is useful for your research. Whether the strength you would like to adopt it, or whether the weakness you would like to overcome it. By knowing the strength and the weakness of certain things, for example, the research design or research methodology, then you know how you're going to improve your research design, avoiding or overcoming the weakness. Or by knowing the strength of certain research design, you do some mix and match with the requirement of your research study, which you found that the one you need is actually the strength that can be given by the respective research method. Therefore, you can choose to adopt it, or probably you would like to modify it to further amplify the strength for you to achieve better the purpose of your research. You may also put or integrate ideas together in an interesting way, because you are talking about a lot of informations, different researchers proposing different theories or principles. Probably you have to look into their connections, see is there any possibility for integrations, and transform it into something new or something better or something more impactful. This shall involve a lot of trying and error, which you never know until you start trying. And this is quite common when you encounter some theories, some equation models, or some applications which you can adopt from different researchers, integrating them together and see how they transform. Or you may also engage yourself with debates. You know that you don't have to always agree with their opinions. You need to know that the researchers are actually reporting what they have observed, how they did the analysis, how they perceive the situations, and what are their findings and opinions. You don't have to fully accept everything they said. Therefore, you can engage yourself with debates, posting queries, seeking for answers, and so on so far. This is quite normal, as this is a part of the academic conversations. As long as your entire process here do not have the motive or intentions to attack a person or to attack the personality of a person, which in fact that person you do not know, then you judge a person by a book's cover, this shouldn't be a good culture of the researcher. Normally we don't do that, because we always have to position ourselves in a very objective manner. Even in our writing, we always position ourselves in the third party. Therefore, doing the literature review, you will have to do it critically. That will make your literature review more interesting, and there will be elements of review, as implied by the term literature review. These are several areas for critics, which you can have those in your mind while you're reading a literature. And these critics can guide you through the critical evaluations of the informations provided by the literature review. For example, the credibility of the sources in terms of the authors or the publications. Sometimes when you want to judge the credibility of the sources, it is rather subjective. However, you can use some indicator for you to have a basic idea of it. It is just an indicator to you as a reference for you to decide the level of acceptance of you out of the information provided by the respective authors or publications. These indicators include whether those journals are high-impact journals, whether those journals are Q1, Q2 journals, where the chances of the publications being rejected is relatively high, or whether those journals are notoriously predatory journals, always seek for academicians, persuading them to publish with a certain paid cost, without concerning the quality of the respective papers. Another way for you to assess the credibility of the sources, you may observe from the peer comments from the other publications within the field. You can easily observe some authors have greater influence over the respective topic, where most of the relevant publications will always mention the name. I believe every field will have at least a few of this kind of authors. At least in my field of study, there are one or two which if you search through the relevant publications, this name always appear. Then you know that the credibility and the quality of the works are well recognized by the research community within the field. Some you can see it through the way it is written, the amount of information provided, the quality of the writings, the regularness in terms how they discuss and analyze the data, and the depth of the study that the authors goes through in order to reach to a certain conclusions or findings. These can be some indicators to you. Probably there are more which you can think of yourself in assessing the credibility of the sources. You know that in the market, there are full with various publications. There are also a very big variations and inconsistency in terms of the quality of work being produced. Therefore, you should be able to wisely choose and identify those which is highly credible in order not to mislead you to the wrong concepts or misunderstanding on certain topics. Next thing you would like to evaluate, it will be the accuracy of underlying assumptions. Some good journals, in their writings, the authors outline the assumptions that they use in acquiring a certain models which are used to simulate something, and then later their study will focus on the model, how the model responds over the changing parameters. Based on the observations of the parametric response, they are trying to explaining a real scenario. In this process, you know that the author is actually doing study on his own model, but what is he trying to explain is actually the real scenario. There is still a gap between the actual situations and the model that the author simulated. Therefore, you will have to look into the assumptions, whether you agree with those assumptions are well justified, whether the simplification made within the model will not significantly affect the simulated outcome, or even slight effect in terms of the simulated outcome. You can still see the trend and there still be meaningful information and finding acquiring from them. I believe it is not a habit for us to really look into the list of the assumptions given by the authors, especially those from the undergraduates haven't go through the training in the postgraduate studies. You will find yourself looking into those assumptions. It will be quite significant. You should train yourself to look into that. And then most of the time, the simulated outcome where the parametric response is very significantly governed by the respective assumptions. By looking into the assumptions, you should be able to more or less gauge or guess or imagine how much is the implications to the simulated results. Then you will decide the level of acceptance in terms of the findings or observations as given by the authors. You might want to also look into the rigor of the study design, whether the research study was carried out in a very rigorous manner, whether precautions has been conducted in order to remove all the systematic errors, whether necessary steps has been taken in order to prevent misleading data, whether the research work are well justified, which is persuasive enough for you to believe in their results and findings. You also want to look into the appropriateness of the methodology, theories, and techniques. You know that if you are using the wrong methodology to test something, there will be results, only that they might give you misleading results. Therefore, you will have to review their methodology. If it is experiment, you will have to look into their experimental setup. Are they using the right instruments? Are the measurements to the required level of accuracy? Are the simulated situations in line with the conditions in the experiment? Or are those theories well justified? Whether they are using the right techniques? And so on so forth. This evaluation process will help you to have an idea when you want to develop your own research study. Let's say now you encounter the research is dealing with computer modeling. Then you will have to be more rigorous in terms of analyzing it. You know that simulations, especially the computer simulations, is very heavily governed by the set of assumptions. which are normally in terms of the figures. And in fact, you know that the actual material, the property may vary slightly, even they are the same material being produced within the same batch of the fabrication process. There will be slight variations. And there are a lot of governing factors that governing the response of the actual situations, which the computer simulations might not be able to cover all the aspects. Therefore, you will have to look into the assumed figures, look into their boundary conditions, and you should have an idea that the simulations in the computer program are normally more ideal, as if everything is perfect in the reality. The one that is not perfect is actually the reality. Therefore, you have to have an idea to which degree this kind of computer simulations are able to reflect the actual situations. These are also the areas of critiques when you do your literature review. Next, it will be the interpretations of the data as well as the interpretations of the findings. You might want to look into the approach, how they process the data, what kind of data that they are acquiring, are those data adequate to reflect the situations, and what those data is actually meaning, any misinterpretations of the data, and even the analysis approach, what kind of approach that the author use. Is it on basis of the first principles, or is it based on the statistical measures? You know that if everything is derived or analyzed on basis of the first principle, at least you have the principles to support the governing response of a particular observations. But if the analysis is based on the statistic, most likely there cannot be any direct measurements. Then the statistic is the best tool for it to measure it. And you know that the statistic normally represent the tendency of a data, probably in terms of the correlations, probably in terms of the empirical or regressions, which might not exactly happen in the actual situations. I'm not saying that statistics is something not good for engineering research. It is depending on different natures of the study. Sometimes we do empirical study, sometimes we do statistical study, sometimes we do numerical study, sometimes we do experimental study, and sometimes we do case study. Whichever the study it is, there will be limitations. No one study can be done in 100% perfect manner. You need to aware that even though you may be in favor of the experimental study, but you know that throughout the process of fabrications of the samples, there are always imperfectness. And then during the process of testing, there will also be imperfectness as well. The only advantage over the experiment is the response you can see it with your naked eyes. Then you feel that one is more real, at least something you can see, you can touch, and you can measure. Actually, statistics is something a good tool also, especially it helps you to do your research design, as well as to help you to analyze the reliability and validity of your results. It might give you some trend, something like best fit trend line, to help you to minimize the errors or variations of your predictions from what is supposed to be in the reality. Whichever the approach that you are using, it must be justified. And when you do this review, you will have to look into those, whether they are persuasive enough to convince you in terms of the justifications as well as the evidence provided, whether they are relevant and providing a good support to their findings. And then you can also have the considerations in terms of the logic of the conclusion drawn, whether the conclusion made are really on basis of the data, results, observations and findings as acquired from the research study, whether the conclusion drawn was a bit biased due to some prior understanding of that particular researcher, whether the conclusion drawn are well justified with good evidence which are undeniably lead to those conclusions. You have to consider at that level. While reading the literature, you can consider yourself as an examiner to the literature. If you think at the level of the examiner, you will need to first vet the quality and the credibility of the information given before you adopt the principles, concepts, findings, and the conclusions given by the respective author. This will be safer to you. When you use those informations, you have higher degree of confidence to accomplish your research study with good supports and evidence in convincing your readers in terms of the credibility of your output of the research. Remember, when you do the critiques, it should be written in the formal style, which is the academic style. And you need to be objective and be respectful to the others' opinions. You have to mind your terms, not to exaggerate certain things, overclaim or underclaim. You need to uphold the professional image as a researcher to increase your own credibilities.